For over 3 decades, America has looked at Brian Urlacher and seen one of the greatest defensive careers in NFL history, a living standard for the concept of the modern linebacker. He was Defensive Rookie of the Year, NFL Defensive Player of the Year in 2005, a familiar face at the Pro Bowl for many years in a row, an All-Pro whom experts mentioned with rare respect. He led the Chicago Bears defense like a tactical brain, reading the game faster than opponents could breathe, showing up at the exact spot the ball needed, and turning chaos into order. The Super Bowl, the dominant seasons, the tackles that became textbook plays, the years when number 54 didn't just represent one player, but the entire defensive identity of a city. That peak was marked by his induction into the Pro Football Hall of Fame, a place reserved only for those who shaped an entire era. From New Mexico to Chicago, from a versatile player few dared bet on to an irreplaceable icon, Brian Urlacher's career is told through awards, titles, stat sheets, and absolute respect from teammates and opponents alike, as if he was born to win, born to stand firm, born never to fall. But right beneath that surface glory, another life persisted stubbornly for 30 years, where every achievement was paid for with pain no one was allowed to see. When fans saw the cold collisions and the decisive get-ups, no one witnessed the mornings when his body was stiff as a board, the pain that had to be swallowed before stepping onto the field, or the willpower forced to overcome the fear that one day his body might no longer obey. Brian Urlacher lived 2 lives in the same body, an icon not allowed to show weakness in public, and a man who had to endure, patch himself up, and stand up again in silence. His willpower wasn't about not feeling pain, but about still stepping onto the field when pain had become a constant state. Not about not being afraid, but about still carrying the central responsibility of the entire defensive system, even knowing each hit could take away another piece of his body. It was in that silence that Brian Urlacher's double life took shape. A man honored for his strength, and another man living on sheer will, stubbornly keeping the icon from collapsing, even as the price paid grew bigger and bigger. If you want to keep exploring the truth behind the invincible image of Brian Urlacher and what he had to sacrifice in silence, please hit subscribe so you don't miss the next part of this story. Brian Urlacher didn't grow up in a loud tragedy, no rainy nights, no slamming doors, no spoken goodbyes. His early tragedy was much quieter, the long absence of his father, a void that lasted long enough to become normal. His father wasn't present in childhood memories as a reachable figure. No lessons, no hand on the shoulder, no words of, "You did good." In Brian Urlacher's inner life, his father wasn't someone lost, but someone who was never really there, and that made the pain harder to name, harder to heal. There were no warm memories to miss, just a question hanging for years. Why did that presence never come? So Brian's childhood had no male role model to mirror, no one to show the boy what a real man was like. He learned to observe the world from a distance, to guess his role in the family on his own, to adjust his emotions so he wouldn't become a burden to a mother already exhausted. In a home where adults were always busy surviving, a child's feelings weren't the priority. Brian wasn't taught to dream, wasn't encouraged to voice sadness. He was taught through silence that enduring alone was the only way to survive. There was no explanation for that absence, no closing words to help the child understand it wasn't his fault, and that lack of closure forced Brian to grow up with an invisible responsibility, always wondering if he was good enough, if he deserved to be kept around. When no one leaves with a goodbye, a child often learns to believe the leaving was about them. Brian Urlacher carried that feeling for a very long time, even if he never named it. In that boy's inner world, strength wasn't something to show off. It was the condition for not being abandoned. Brian learned to toughen up, not to outdo others, but because weakness was never a safe choice. When no one protected him emotionally, his body became the first and only line of defense, Every fall, every pain, that boy got up faster than necessary, as if telling himself that if he didn't go down, maybe the world wouldn't leave again. That childhood didn't create a rebellious kid, nor a victim. It created a quiet person, used to keeping everything inside, used to not demanding attention, and gradually equating self-worth with the ability to endure. Brian didn't learn to dream romantically about the future. He learned to prepare for impact. While other kids dreamed of who they'd become, Brian learned to make sure he wouldn't be sidelined. That long absence didn't vanish as Brian grew up. It wasn't resolved, wasn't talked through, wasn't closed. It just changed shape. Later, when he stepped into noisy locker rooms, stood amid a crowded defense, became the center of a system everyone relied on. The old feeling was still there. If I'm not strong enough, if I slow down, if I weaken, everything could leave me at any moment. It was a wordless fear, formed very early, when a boy learned to endure before he even knew he was allowed to dream of anything. And it was from that original tragedy, the unexplained, unanswered, unclosed absence, that Brian Urlacher stepped into life with instincts already shaped. Don't expect, don't complain, don't depend. The boy back then didn't wait for anyone to come back and fill the void. He chose to make himself something hard to forget. But from that same place, a quiet paradox formed. To never lose again, Brian learned not to need anyone, and the price was a childhood with no room for softness, no place to set down sadness, and no warm memory to return to when life later got too heavy. The only woman fully present in Brian Urlacher's childhood wasn't the image of gentle, nurturing mom people usually associate with the word. She didn't have that luxury. Life didn't allow her softness, and circumstances didn't give her time to hold her kids long and whisper comfort. Brian's mother was a woman exhausted early on, thrust into the sole provider role before things could stabilize, and from that moment, weakness became a luxury she couldn't afford. In that house, there was no space for fragility, because every day was a survival equation. Money, work, kids who needed food, clothes, and to keep living without being allowed to fall. Brian grew up seeing that through a child's eyes that had to understand too soon. He saw his mom leave early and return when it was dark, saw shoulders always tense, saw fatigue hidden behind firm decisions. She didn't cry in front of her kids. Not because she didn't hurt, but because tears didn't make tomorrow easier. In her world, love wasn't shown through words or hugs, but through not letting this family collapse. And that rough but steadfast way of loving became the air Brian breathed every day. There, discipline wasn't an parenting method. It was the natural reflex of someone trying to hold everything upright. No one told Brian you have to be strong, but everything around him sent the same message. Don't be a burden. When mom was already worn out, the kids had no right to add more fatigue. When money was a constant worry, emotions got pushed to the bottom. Brian learned that not through lectures, but through how his mother existed day by day. There were no long storytelling evenings, no talks about fears or dreams. Brian wasn't asked how he felt. He was watched to make sure he didn't mess up. And in that silence, the boy began to understand that love, in this family, took the shape of responsibility. Loving meant going to work even when tired. Loving meant not complaining. Loving meant standing straight when there was no strength left. Brian grew up not in gentle arms, but in an environment where endurance was the moral standard. That didn't turn him into a bitter child. It turned him into a child who observed, who restrained himself, and who early understood that to survive safely, he had to control himself before controlling the world. While other kids were allowed to show vulnerability, Brian learned to hide it. While others were allowed to be disappointed, he learned to swallow it. Not because he had no feelings, but because feelings didn't help in a family fighting day by day. That mother, with all her toughness, didn't deliberately steal her son's childhood. She was just doing the only thing she knew, surviving. But that very survival unintentionally passed to Brian a harsh message. To be kept around, you have to endure. No one said it out loud, but it was there in every decision, every look, every silence, when there was no time to soothe. Brian wasn't taught to rely on anyone because the only person he could rely on was too busy not falling herself. Looking back, that mother didn't give Brian softness, but she gave him something far heavier: the ability to stand when no one was holding him up. She didn't allow herself weakness, so she didn't create space for her son to be weak either. And so, while the outside world later saw a cold, solid Brian Urlacher who showed no emotion, very few understood that it was forged from those early years, in a home where gentleness wasn't enough to pay the bills. Brian didn't grow up in gentle love, but in the discipline of survival, a kind of discipline that didn't come from whips or commands, but from the invisible pressure of not being allowed to fail. That boy understood early on that if he went down, no one had the strength to carry him instead. And that's why Brian learned to brace himself before he even knew a child had the right to be weak. From that exhausted mother, he didn't inherit softness. He inherited something else: the will to survive, in silence. Something that would later follow him onto massive stadiums where tens of thousands cheered for his strength without ever knowing it was built from days and months with no room for fragility. After years of growing up in a home with no space for weakness, Brian Urlacher gradually came to a quiet but life-defining realization. The body is the only thing that doesn't abandon you. People can disappear, promises can fail to show up, presence can fade into silence, but the body is there, responding instantly, honest to the point of cruelty. When he ran faster, it answered. When he got stronger, it held firm. When he crashed into contact, it hurt, but it didn't vanish. For a child who grew up amid unexplained voids, that certainty carried survival meaning. Brian didn't call it a choice. It was instinct. If the world guarantees nothing, then at least this body has to obey me. Sports entered Brian's life not as a romantic dream, but as a test. Every practice was an unspoken question. Am I strong enough to stay? And every hit became an answer. While other kids played for fun, Brian played to prove he existed. Pain didn't make him back off. On the contrary, it confirmed he was still standing here, still not sidelined. Every fall, every bruise, every time he got up faster than necessary, was a way of telling himself he hadn't been left behind again. In Brian's inner world, contact wasn't danger, it was assurance. The body gradually became armor. Not shiny armor, but rough protection forged from repeated endurance. Brian learned to trust the weight of himself, to believe that if he was fast enough, strong enough, tough enough, he would always have a place. When emotions had nowhere to shelter, the body became the only place he could put faith. He didn't learn to voice fear. He learned to run straight through it. And the more he ran, the more he hit, the more he was recognized, the stronger the link between pain and self-worth became. It was during this phase that Brian's double life began to take shape, even if no one named it yet. On the outside, he was the strong, quiet kid who didn't complain, the one coaches trusted because he could take it. He wasn't talkative, but he was always put into the toughest situations. And every time he came through, the adults' eyes lit up, as if saying, "Yeah, this kid doesn't break easy." That recognition, however sparse, became one of the rare things that filled the void in Brian. But inside, another life ran parallel. It was the life of the fear of being left behind, the nameless fear that had followed him from very early on. Brian didn't charge into hits because he loved violence. He charged in because he feared the opposite, feared slowing down, feared being replaced, feared that one day, when he wasn't strong enough anymore, people would turn their backs just like the absences before. Every time his body hurt, he didn't see it as a sign to stop. He saw it as a reminder that he was still needed. And so Brian didn't learn to listen to his body in the sense of healing. He learned to command it to keep going. At an age when many kids were still figuring out who they were, Brian unconsciously tied his human value to his ability to take hits. He didn't ask who he wanted to become. He asked how much he could endure. And the answer, time after time, was a little more. One more hit. One more practice. One more pain. No one demanded it of him, but in Brian's inner world, stopping meant risking being forgotten. As his body grew stronger, that armor thickened, covering even the most fragile parts. Brian learned to show up as if nothing could hurt him. He walked with a solid stance, spoke little, reacted fast, and was always ready to dive into the most dangerous part of the game. Those around him saw a tough kid with potential, with guts. Few realized that those guts were built on a very different foundation: the fear of losing his spot. The double life at this point wasn't pretense yet. It was a defense mechanism. On the outside, Brian built the image of someone who didn't need anyone, a body ready to bear anything. Inside, he clung to the worry that if he wasn't strong enough, the world would keep leaving without looking back. And to prevent that, Brian chose to turn his body into the answer to every doubt. It was from that moment that the path was set, a path where every hit wasn't just a play, but a silent affirmation: I'm still here. Brian Urlacher didn't know this unconscious choice would follow him for decades, lifting him to the heights of glory, while planting the seeds for the long-lasting pain to come. But at that time, all he knew was a simple, brutal truth. In a world that promised nothing, this body was the only thing he could trust, and he was willing to use it like armor to protect his right to exist. The first time Brian Urlacher got praise, not for speed, not for strategy, but because he took pain really well. It wasn't a grand moment, no big applause, just a casual remark from an adult, a satisfied nod, a look of approval. But for Brian, it rang like a milestone. In a world where presence was always fragile, where affection wasn't spoken, and bonds could vanish without warning, being seen for the ability to endure meant more than any other praise. For the first time, he understood that pain wasn't just something to overcome, it was something that could create value. From that moment, Brian's relationship with pain began to change. Pain stopped being a warning signal and became a measure. When he got knocked down and stood right back up, the coach's eyes lit up. When he kept practicing even though his body was exhausted, people started to trust him. No one said he had to torture himself, but the reactions around him taught Brian a very clear lesson: whoever endures more gets to stay. And for a kid who had learned early to fear abandonment, that was a rule that didn't need questioning. Brian didn't complain about pain, not because he felt nothing, but because he realized that every time he endured in silence, he got closer to recognition. The bruises became signs of effort. The lingering aches became proof he was doing it right. When his body sent signals to rest, Brian learned to ignore them. Not out of recklessness, but because resting brought no approving looks. Pain did. Pain got him named. Pain made him seen as reliable. At an age when many were still exploring their limits, Brian was pulled into a dangerous but subtle loop. The more it hurt, the more he was recognized. The more he was recognized, the more he had to endure. No one forced him into that loop, but it ran so smoothly it needed no orders. Every time Brian gritted his teeth and kept going, he reinforced the belief that his worth was tied to his capacity to endure. And once a belief like that takes root, it doesn't just shape behavior, it shapes how a person sees themselves. From the outside, Brian gradually came to be seen as a tough, reliable kid who didn't demand, didn't complain. Those comments sounded positive, but they also created a mold he had to keep meeting. Once labeled as someone who took pain well, showing fatigue became dangerous, because if one day he stopped, if he said he wasn't okay, would those approving looks disappear? And so, Brian chose the safest thing he knew: keep enduring. Pain, from a personal experience, gradually became a kind of social language. Brian learned to communicate through his pain, even without words. A powerful play, a hit without hesitation, a quicker-than-expected return to the field, all sent the same message: I'm still useful. I still deserve to be here. In the process, the line between the person and the role began to blur. Brian wasn't just playing sports. He was performing the role of the endurer. This is where the tragedy began to sink in deep. When pain is praised, the person starts erasing themselves without realizing it. Brian stopped asking what he felt and started asking if he could take more. He didn't judge a practice day by what he learned, but by how many limits he pushed past. The fragile parts of himself, fear, hesitation, the need for rest, were gradually pushed into silence, not because they disappeared, but because they weren't praised. That loop was especially dangerous for someone like Brian, who grew up amid absence and survival discipline, with no foundation of gentleness to balance it. Being praised for enduring felt like the ultimate validation. It told him, if you endure enough, you'll be kept. And so Brian didn't just endure pain on the field, he began organizing his whole life around that ability. Pain became so familiar that its absence started to cause anxiety. Brian's double life was clearer now. On the outside, he was the image of strength and resilience, someone others could lean on. Inside, he grew further from his own true signals. The fear of being left didn't disappear. It was just covered by thicker armor, and every praise for his endurance made that armor heavier. Brian didn't realize that while he was building value through pain, he was also learning to dismiss his own need for protection. There was no explosive moment, no shock that made Brian stop and think. This transformation happened slowly, logically, almost invisibly. Every small praise, every satisfied look, every time he was chosen over someone else, they all came together into one consistent message: pain is something to be proud of. And when a person believes that pain gives them value, self-erasure is only a matter of time. Brian Urlacher never intentionally tried to destroy himself. He was just doing what his surroundings taught him was right. But right from that first moment, he was praised for taking pain well. A path opened up. A path where pain was no longer something to avoid, but something to accumulate. And on that path, Brian walked very steadily, completely unaware that every step forward was also a step further away from listening to himself. Chicago didn't wait for Brian Urlacher like a fairy tale. That city doesn't believe in heroes born to shine. Chicago believes in endurance. It believes in people who can stand in the middle of the rage of failure, of brutal weather, of a history full of bitterness, and still not back down. When Brian set foot in this city, he didn't just join a football team. He stepped into a collective space where pain was the common language, where the memories of defeats had never fully healed, and where fans didn't need a star who could smile. They needed someone willing to take the hits for them. The Chicago Bears back then weren't looking for a leader in the glamorous sense. They were looking for a fulcrum of force, someone who could absorb collisions, absorb teammates' mistakes, absorb the anger from the stands every time everything fell apart. Brian Urlacher arrived at exactly the right time, in exactly the shape this city needed. That build, those eyes, that silence, everything said the same thing: this guy can take it. And Chicago, with its very distinct collective instinct, recognized it immediately. Here, no one asked Brian if he was tired. No one asked how much it hurt. The only questions that mattered were, can he still stand? And is he ready to stand there again? Chicago didn't need a protected hero. Chicago needed someone to stand in front of everything, so the city could throw every expectation, every disappointment, every accumulated resentment from years past at him. Brian, with his personal history, didn't resist that role. On the contrary, he stepped into it as if he'd been prepared for it a very long time. On the field, Brian quickly became the center of every defensive system, not just because of his talent, but because his presence brought a sense of safety. When Brian was there, others could make mistakes, could be a beat slow, could lose position because they believed someone was ready to dive into the gap for them. Gradually, that burden stopped being tactical. It became an invisible expectation. Every game, every big play, eyes turned to number 54, as if every answer had to pass through his body first before being accepted. Chicago is an angry city in its own very particular way. Angry because of an unforgiving history, angry because of unfinished promises, angry because of incomplete seasons. And when a city carries that anger into the stadium, they need a place to unload it. Brian Urlacher, gradually, became that place. Not because he wanted to be the sacrifice, but because he had never learned how to refuse the role of the endurer. In those early years, the bond between Brian and Chicago felt almost ideal. The city loved him because he represented what they respected most: uncomplaining resilience. Brian loved the city because here he didn't need to explain why he was silent, why he charged into plays others avoided. Chicago understood that language, and that understanding quickly pushed the relationship beyond the boundary between player and team, turning it into an unspoken pact. You endure for us, and we will trust you. But every pact has its price. When an entire city places all its faith in one person, that person no longer has the right to be a fully individual human being. Brian didn't just have to play well, he had to endure everything. When the defense collapsed, he had to be the one to take responsibility. When opponents broke through the line, the first eyes looked for him. No one said it out loud, but it hung in the air. If someone has to take the blame, it will be Brian Urlacher. And Brian, with instincts shaped very early, accepted it almost naturally. He didn't react, didn't argue, didn't demand to share the load. He stepped into that position as if it had long been familiar. Because deep down, this role of living shield answered an old fear. If I carry enough, I won't be left behind. Chicago gave Brian the greatest recognition, but it also unintentionally reinforced the dangerous belief that his value lay in his ability to take hits. As seasons passed, Brian's body began to register the first signs of wear. But up in the stands, no one saw it. They saw someone who always showed up on time, always got back up after contact, always kept playing as if pain was insignificant. Every time Brian forced himself up, the city nodded in satisfaction. And every nod pushed him deeper into the role that had been shaped, the one who takes the hits for everyone. In Chicago, the idea of a hero is very different. A hero isn't the one who wins in bright lights. It's the one who stands in the rain and wind the longest without stepping out. Brian Urlacher became exactly that kind of icon. But in the process of becoming an icon, he gradually lost the right to be acknowledged as a human with limits. When an entire city needed him as their shield, admitting fatigue became taboo. Brian's double life therefore moved into a new, heavier phase. On the outside, he was the embodiment of Chicago's spirit. Tough, silent, unrelenting. On the inside, he kept accumulating pain, not just from the hits, but from the pressure of representing the collective anger of millions. Brian wasn't just playing ball for the Bears. He was playing ball for a city accustomed to living with disappointment and needing someone strong enough to carry it. Chicago doesn't need heroes, because heroes can fall. Chicago needs someone who isn't allowed to fall. And in the moment Brian Urlacher accepted becoming the living shield for this city, his personal tragedy merged with the collective tragedy, creating a relationship that was both honoring and cruel. Because when an entire city relies on you to endure in their place, protecting yourself stops being a priority. And Brian, once again, didn't ask questions. He just kept standing there, in the middle of Chicago's rage, absorbing it all, as if that was the only thing he was born to do. As seasons passed in Chicago, Brian Urlacher's double life was no longer just a quiet defense mechanism. It began to frame him, tighten around him, and gradually turn into a prison. Every game he stepped onto the field, the image was elevated another layer, while the human inside shrank a little more. It wasn't a sudden trade-off. It was a steady accumulation, where every successful play brought a new demand. Keep doing it, be stronger, be quieter, don't break. Up in the stands, Brian increasingly became more of an idea than a person. Number 54, no longer attached to a body that could feel pain, but to an invisible commitment. When things get bad, he will step up. And because he always stepped up, the question, can he still take it, gradually disappeared from the collective vocabulary. The image grew by draining the space for personal truth. Every time Brian played a full game, even when his body protested, the crowd learned another dangerous lesson. He can take it all. But the real human doesn't operate on symbolic logic. In the locker room, when the outside noise died down, Brian had to face a different reality. His body needed time, needed to be listened to, needed to be acknowledged. Yet those needs had no fitting language to exist in the role he carried. An icon isn't allowed to complain. A cornerstone isn't allowed to ask for a break. And a living shield isn't allowed to turn its back on the city's anger. Every game, therefore, became a closed loop. Brian stepped onto the field amid cheers, braced himself to fulfill the assigned role, then walked backstage with a heavier body and a thinner spirit. The image grew bigger, the human smaller, not because he wanted to disappear, but because there was no longer room for him to exist as a full individual. Everything had to be simplified to fit the icon, and the first thing always simplified was his own voice. The double life at this point was no longer two parallel lives. It was one life pressing down on the other. The icon part dominated the public space, while the human part was pushed into the shadows, allowed to appear only in very brief and very private moments. Brian learned to switch off. Not to switch off emotions in the sense of becoming emotionless, but to switch off the ability to express them. Everything was kept inside, neatly arranged, so as not to disturb the smoothly running machine in front of the public. That silence didn't always bring peace. On the contrary, it accumulated into pressure with no outlet. Brian wasn't allowed to say he feared the next hit. Wasn't allowed to admit there were mornings when it took many minutes just to stand straight. Wasn't allowed to ask if continuing to carry everything was still reasonable, because once that question was spoken, the entire symbolic structure would wobble. And Chicago, like the NFL, wasn't designed to handle questions that shake faith. At this stage, Brian no longer played just to win. He played to maintain the image, and maintaining it demanded an ever higher level of sacrifice. Every time he pushed past his limits, those limits were pushed further, as if his endurance was an infinite resource. No one deliberately exploited him. The system just did what it always does: make use of what works. And Brian, with a personal history that had taught him being kept around, was the ultimate reward, kept meeting the demand. But inside, the real person began to shrink. Personal thoughts became brief, interrupted by responsibility. Moments of wondering, who am I, off the field grew rare, and were quickly snuffed out, because they didn't serve the next game. Brian didn't lose himself in one big event. He was worn down little by little, every time he put the role above his needs, every time he chose silence over speaking up. The prison of the double life had no bars or locked doors. It was built from expectations, from admiration, from praise for the ability to endure. And what made it hardest to escape was the fact that Brian had once craved exactly those things: being recognized, being trusted, being seen as unbreakable. When those cravings were met, refusing the price that came with them became almost impossible. With every game that passed, Brian's image was reinforced, and at the same time, the distance between him and himself widened. The human wasn't allowed to speak, wasn't allowed to stop, wasn't allowed to exist outside the role. And in that prolonged silence, Brian began to get used to not listening to what was happening inside. It was a skill he had learned very early on, now elevated to a professional level. The tragedy of this phase wasn't in any specific injury or obvious failure. It lay in the complete identification between human value and public image. When every eye saw only the icon, the person behind gradually became invisible even to himself. Brian kept standing firm, kept enduring, kept fulfilling the role, but every time he did, he locked himself deeper into the prison that no one else had the key to. The double life, from a survival strategy, had become a structure of confinement. The icon wasn't allowed to break, because if it broke, the whole city would collapse in a way they wouldn't accept. And the human wasn't allowed to speak, because if he did, he would have to face the hardest question. Who am I when I can no longer endure for everyone? In that silence, Brian Urlacher kept stepping onto the field, each time a little less himself, but much more in the eyes of others. A paradox that could only exist in a world where strength is honored above truth. At some point, Brian Urlacher's body stopped sending vague signals. It begged, not with ordinary fatigue, but with specific, persistent pains that had clear addresses and refused to go away. Knees no longer responded right away when he stood up. Neck stiffened after every practice. Back ached as if carrying a nameless weight. Those pains didn't arrive all at once. They lined up, piled on each other, patient, as if knowing that if they waited long enough, there would finally be no room left to dodge them. But in this phase of the double life, the body had lost its voting rights. The icon had taken over the decision-making space entirely. Every morning, when Brian woke up and needed a few extra seconds to remember how to operate his own body, he didn't see it as a sign to stop. He saw it as procedure, part of the job, a fee that had to be paid to keep existing in the role that the whole city, the whole team, the whole system had grown accustomed to depending on. Painkillers began slipping into his routine quietly. No drama, no theatrics, no single fall moment, just a practical solution to a specific problem: how to make the body hold out for one more game. At first, the meds only appeared when truly needed. Then, gradually, they became the buffer, a way to bring the body back to barely functional. Brian wasn't chasing comfort. He was chasing the ability to continue. On the outside, the image didn't change. He still showed up on time, still took the field, still read plays faster than anyone else, still was the center everyone relied on. No one saw the silent negotiation happening every day between body and will. The body said, "Stop." The will answered, "Not yet." And in that lopsided dialogue, the will always won, not because it was right, but because it was backed by an entire system that accepted no other option. Injury upon injury didn't just damage tissue and joints, they eroded the ability to listen. When pain became a constant state, the line between not okay and normal blurred. Brian no longer asked if he was healthy, he asked if he was healthy enough to play. That was a different question, with lower standards and a higher price. In the locker room, the silences stretched longer, not because there was nothing to say, but because nothing was allowed to be said. Pains were handled quickly, efficiently, without emotion. They were logged as data, not as warnings. Brian became an expert at optimizing endurance, knowing which dose kept him upright, which movements to avoid, when to brace hard, and when he could relax for a few rare seconds. In this phase, the double life reached its cruelest level. On the outside, Brian was living proof of never giving up. On the inside, he was a man negotiating day by day with his own body to keep the icon from collapsing. The body begged to stop, not out of weakness, but because it was doing its job, warning when risk exceeded the safety threshold. But the icon wasn't allowed to understand that. The icon understood only one command: continue. Every time Brian stepped onto the field less than whole, the system learned another wrong lesson. He can take more than we thought. And each time, the endurance threshold was pushed a little further. No one deliberately set out to destroy him. They just reacted to what they saw. And what they saw was a man who always stood firm. But standing firm didn't mean staying whole. After every game, Brian brought home a body that needed more time to recover, a mind increasingly weary from constantly denying the truth. The truth that pain wasn't the enemy, it was a message. But in his world, that message had no recipient. There were nights Brian lay still, not to rest, but to wait for the pain to ease enough to sleep. Those moments never appeared in any news report. They didn't fit the story of resilience the public needed to believe. And so they existed in the shadows, where the real person had to deal alone with the consequences of the role he held. The tragedy wasn't that Brian used painkillers. The tragedy was that he needed them to fulfill his role properly. When a person has to rely on numbing his body to keep being seen as useful, the line between dedication and self-destruction becomes dangerously thin. Brian wasn't trying to escape reality. He faced it the only way he knew: keep carrying. The body begged to stop, but the mind refused, not out of pride, but out of fear. Fear that if he stopped, he would no longer be needed. Fear that if he listened, he would have to face the question delayed too long: who am I when I can no longer endure like before? And in that fear, Brian kept stepping onto the field, each time with less strength, but with unchanged resolve. By the end of this phase, the wear was no longer something that could be denied, but denial was no longer a choice. It had become a skill. Brian Urlacher lived in the rhythm of meds, of rushed recoveries, of practices adjusted to avoid total breakdown. The body kept begging, clearer every day. But the icon, nourished by expectations and collective faith, wasn't allowed to hear. And it was in that refusal to listen that the tragedy took one long step forward, not loud, not explosive, but certain and irreversible. As Brian Urlacher's body grew more exhausted and his mind grew more accustomed to silence, another front began to crack, not loudly, not in collapse. No one stood up and walked away in anger. Brian Urlacher's marriage wasn't crushed by scandal or betrayal, but by something far crueler: prolonged silence. There was no single moment to point to and say, "This is where it started." Just the feeling that two people who had once been very close, over time, could no longer reach each other. On the outside, everything still looked fine. Brian was still the icon of strength and discipline. The family still existed in the public frame as a complete part of the success story. But inside that house, the rhythm of life had changed. Brian brought home a heavy body and a mind accustomed to closing off. After games, after practices, after days when the body begged for rest, he no longer had energy left to open up. Not because he didn't care, but because his entire emotional capacity had been spent elsewhere. Brian's partner didn't face an angry or irresponsible man. She faced a man absent even in his own presence. Brian was there physically, but his spirit stayed on the field, in the locker room, in the endless negotiations with his body. Simple questions like, "Are you okay?" gradually became hard to answer, not because there was no answer, but because answering required an admission Brian wasn't used to. Admitting he was exhausted, admitting he was no longer whole. In that marriage, no one raised their voice, no one threw things, no one accused, and because of that, the pain was even harder to identify. Conversations grew shorter, silences grew longer. The two began living next to each other instead of with each other. Brian didn't know how to bring what was happening inside out into words. His whole life had taught him that speaking didn't make things better. On the field, silence was strength. In the family, silence became a wall. Those rare days off no longer brought connection. Brian didn't know how to fully switch from the role of icon to the role of husband. He carried the same defensive mechanism into a space that was supposed to need softness. When the other person needed to be heard, Brian brought endurance. When a hug was needed, he brought formal presence. Neither of them was wrong. They just no longer spoke the same language. As time passed, the distance wasn't filled by big moments, but by hundreds of unnoticed small details. Silent meals, evenings no longer waited for, glances passing over each other without stopping. Brian didn't realize he was withdrawing. He was just doing what he did best, enduring and continuing. But marriage doesn't run on the ability to endure. It needs emotional presence, something Brian had less and less capacity to provide. No one stood up and said, "We're losing each other." There was no final conversation to close it. The relationship wore down the same way his body wore down, slow, steady, undramatic. And when a marriage breaks in that way, the pain doesn't explode and then settle. It spreads, simmers, with no clear endpoint. Brian didn't experience loss as something taken away. He experienced the realization that it had been gone for a long time. In that silence, Brian withdrew even more, not because he didn't care about family, but because he didn't know how to exist in a space that demanded openness when his entire life had been built on staying closed. The field taught him that if he broke, the whole system would collapse. Marriage taught him that if he didn't speak, the whole relationship would slowly disappear. But the second lesson came too late, when the distance had already become habit. When the marriage ended, it didn't leave loud fragments. It left a void that's hard to name. No one to blame. No moment to go back and fix. Brian faced that reality with the same familiar reflex. Silence, endurance, continuation. But this time, there was no field to pour the pain into. No stands to drown the feeling of loss in noise. Just one man facing the consequences of having lived too long in a role that wasn't allowed to speak. Marriages that break in silence are often the most painful, because they don't give the people inside a chance to fight, to argue, to hope things could be different. Brian Urlacher didn't lose his family in one explosive moment. He lost it little by little, in the very silence he had learned to trust his whole life. And when that door closed, he kept walking as he always had, carrying one more wound without sound, but no less heavy than any hit on the field. When the marriage broke in silence, Brian Urlacher stepped into another phase of the double life with no preparation at all. This time, not on the field, not in front of the stands, but in an even harsher space, the role of father under lights that had never been turned on. For Brian Urlacher, this wasn't the story of a man protected by the media, not an image staged to preserve the icon. This was a human being forced to confront the consequences of his private life head-on. No defense, no shielding, no safe script. The DNA event arrived not as a media explosion, but as a deep crack in his personal life. No team stepped in to shape the narrative. No polished statement to soothe public opinion. Just one man forced to face the truth in silence, while the world continued to see him as an invincible warrior. Brian didn't dodge. He didn't choose denial through noise, nor did he seek pity. He faced it the way he had known his whole life, taking responsibility without saying much. In those moments, Brian was no longer Chicago's defensive icon, no longer number 54 standing in the middle of a city's rage. He was a man standing before a simple but heavy question. What do I do next? Being a father wasn't a role practiced in the gym, not a skill perfected through physical discipline. It demanded emotional presence, something Brian had to relearn from scratch, while his entire previous life had been built on hiding emotion. There were no stadium lights shining on the moments Brian wondered if he was capable of doing it right. No crowd cheering when he chose to face it instead of running. Those decisions happened in the dark, where no one awards medals for quiet maturity. Brian wasn't given a heroic role in the fatherhood story. He was only given responsibility. and that responsibility came without instructions. The most painful thing wasn't that the story got exposed, but the gap between the public image and personal reality. While everyone still saw a strong, confident, unshakable man, Brian had to face the awkwardness of a father starting late. No gentle foundation from childhood to hold on to, no male role model to follow. Brian had to build his own definition of fatherhood while still carrying the legacy of silence that had followed him for decades. No one stepped up to shield him from reductive judgments, but Brian also didn't try to defend himself with words. He understood, perhaps deeper than anyone, that there are moments in life when silence is no longer a refuge, but a space to take responsibility. Fatherhood, in this case, wasn't about reclaiming an image. It was about accepting a reality that couldn't be fixed with reputation. In this new double life, loneliness took a different shape. No longer the loneliness of the one taking hits on the field, but the loneliness of someone who had to learn to show up when no one was applauding. Brian wasn't allowed to fail in a way the public would accept. He also wasn't allowed to succeed in a way that would be celebrated. Every effort happened out of sight, where there was no instant validation, where progress was measured in very small, very private things. There were evenings with nothing to tell the world, but they were the evenings Brian had to face himself the most. Questions about responsibility, about presence, about what he had missed, and what could still be made up. No one taught him how to be a father in these circumstances. No one gave him the right to fail and try again in public. But Brian still chose to face it, not because he was sure he would do it well, but because avoidance was no longer an option. The theme of this phase wasn't redemption, nor was it salvation. It was acceptance. Acceptance that some parts of life can't be edited with strength or discipline. Acceptance that fatherhood isn't a game with clear rules. And acceptance that sometimes the most right thing a person can do is stay, even when no one is watching. Brian Urlacher had spent most of his life becoming a warrior in other people's eyes. But in the shadows of fatherhood, there were no victories to celebrate, no icon to preserve. Just a man trying to show up the best way he could, while the whole world continued to remember him for the hits and the plays. And right here, the double life reached its deepest paradox. As Brian learned to be a father in the dark, the warrior image the world honored didn't help. It even obscured the real person, quietly learning to take responsibility in a completely different sense. The Super Bowl came to Brian Urlacher like the peak every sports story promises, but very rarely tells the real price behind it. That day, when Brian Urlacher stepped onto the biggest stage of his career, the whole world saw a defensive leader who had brought Chicago back to where they had waited for many years. Bright lights, national anthem, history unfolding. It should have been the moment of wholeness. But beneath the uniform, inside the body that had once carried an entire city, Brian had already lost almost everything he had. Knees were no longer flexible joints. They were structures held stable by will, tape, and the habit of endurance. Every run was a calculation, fast enough to hide the slowness, solid enough not to betray teammates. Neck no longer turned naturally. It stiffened after years of collisions, like a worn hinge still forced to open and close. The body no longer obeyed on instinct. It needed commands, rhythm, absolute control to keep functioning. And Brian understood that before the game even started. This was the bitter paradox of the peak. When the whole world believed you were at your strongest, inside, the debts of endurance had come due. Brian didn't step into the Super Bowl with unconditional joy. He stepped in with a cold awareness. This body had paid too much, and today might be the last time it paid more. But the icon wasn't allowed to hesitate. The icon had to show up on time, in place, in role. In the first plays, Brian read the game like he always had. Mind still sharp, tactical map still clear. But between thought and action, a very small delay appeared. just small enough for the crowd not to notice, big enough for the body to feel. That was the moment Brian understood this peak. Arrived when the human had been worn down almost completely. He didn't lose ability. He lost ease. Everything required double effort to achieve the old result. On the field, no one saw those signals. They saw number 54, standing at the center, directing, reacting, continuing to carry. They saw the complete icon, uncracked, but that icon was held together by fragile glue, the refusal to listen to the body. Brian didn't stop to ask how much percentage he had left. He continued because he was used to using whatever remained. When a person has lived long enough in the role of endurer, the question how much left becomes meaningless. Only the question, is it enough to keep going, remains. The Super Bowl, in the popular story, is where every sacrifice gets rewarded. In Brian's real story, it was where the sacrifices gathered. Every ache, every painkiller injection, every stiff morning, they all converged on one day, not to disappear, but to be obscured by the lights. The peak didn't erase the price. It only made the price harder to see. Amid the tense series of plays, Brian had to negotiate with his neck every time he turned his head, with his knees every time he changed direction. He adjusted his stance, conserved movement, chose positions earlier to compensate for the delay his body caused. That was the intelligence of someone who had already paid the price, not of someone still whole. And it was that very intelligence that kept him standing at the center of the stage, while his body had long since drifted far from its starting point. The greatest moment of his career, therefore, carried a different shade. It wasn't an explosion of potential. It was the end point of an endurance curve. When the noise surged, when history was being written, Brian had no space to feel it fully. He was doing what he had always done, fulfilling the role. And fulfilling that role, this time, demanded more than anything before. In the locker room, when the stage lights temporarily moved away, the body spoke more clearly. The pains no longer waited. They arrived like final bills placed on the table. Brian knew, no matter the outcome, there would be no miracle. The body had given almost everything. What remained was will and habit, two things that couldn't replace worn tissue, cartilage, or ligaments. The theme of that day wasn't win or lose. It was timing. The peak arrived exactly when the human had paid almost everything he had. That didn't diminish the value of the moment. It made the moment heavier. Because to stand there, Brian had carried his entire history of endurance. And to leave there, he had to accept that he could no longer continue as before. When the Super Bowl ended, the world kept the image of the icon. Brian kept the feeling of a body that had said everything it needed to say. From that day forward, it was no longer a question of whether he could still play at the highest level. The question was what the next price would be. And in the silence after the peak, Brian understood something very few want to admit. Some great moments aren't great because they open a future, but because they mark that most of the future has already been traded away. After the Super Bowl, there was no applause for the hardest part of Brian Urlacher's career. No grand ceremony, no soundtrack for the phase every athlete fears facing, the prolonged decline. For Brian Urlacher, each following season was no longer a new chapter full of promise, but a repeated negotiation with himself. Should I keep going today or not? And every time he successfully convinced himself, the price paid rose a little more. Mornings no longer began with readiness. They began with checking whether the body would allow him to stand fully. Knees responded sluggishly like an old door. Neck needed time to remember its range of motion. Movements that were once instinct now became a chain of commands that had to be repeated. Brian no longer asked, "Am I healthy?" He asked, "Do I have enough to get through today?" That question, repeated by season, by week, by every practice, and every time the answer was yes, it brought a new worry. How much longer can this go on? The feeling of being betrayed by his own body didn't come like a sudden stab. It came like the fatigue of an old friend who had worked too long without rest. Brian understood his body better than anyone, and because of that, he felt every sign of the decline clearly. But understanding didn't mean acceptance. Acceptance required something the icon role didn't allow: admitting limits. And in the world he lived in, limits were something no one wanted to hear. As each season passed, preparation became more complicated. Recovery time stretched longer. Workouts had to be adjusted. Rest days were no longer optional. They were survival requirements. Brian stepped onto the field with a different plan: play smarter to make up for not being as fast as before. He read plays earlier, chose positions more precisely, cut unnecessary movements. That was admirable adaptation, but it was also a clear sign of decline. No one cheered for that adaptation. The crowd only cheered for results. And when results no longer came easily, silence appeared. Not the silence of respect, but the silence of unmet expectations. Brian heard it, even when no one said it out loud. He knew, in Chicago, patience wasn't infinite. And he knew, every time the body didn't respond like before, collective faith was tested. The tragedy of this phase was that there was no moment to stop completely. No single injury big enough to force him off the field. Just pains big enough to endure, big enough to continue, and numerous enough to wear him down bit by bit. Brian wasn't pushed out of the game. He kept himself in it by shrinking the real person to fit the remaining role. Each season was a silent promise to himself. Just one more time. Just one more year. Just one more chance to prove the icon still stands. But the more that promise repeated, the wider the gap between will and reality grew. The body began refusing commands that were once familiar. It didn't rebel loudly. It simply stopped cooperating. And in that lack of cooperation, Brian clearly felt something painful. The body was no longer armor. It had become the limit. There were days Brian wondered what he was still fighting for. Not titles, those had already come. Not recognition, he had more than enough. Maybe he was fighting for the consistency of the story, that he was the one who doesn't break. But keeping that story seamless required ignoring the ugly chapters. And those ugly chapters were the present. In the locker room, younger faces appeared. Faster, healthier, with fewer painful memories. Brian saw the team's future, and he also saw his own past in them. The comparison didn't need words. It was there in the practice rhythm, in recovery speed, in how bodies responded to demands. Brian wasn't jealous. He understood the rule. But understanding didn't make the sadness lighter, because every comparison was another confrontation with the truth that time wasn't on his side. This prolonged decline had no climax. It didn't allow a clear ending for the crowd to stand and applaud. It just stretched on, steadily, until the person inside had to make the hardest decision. And that decision wasn't cheered. No one chanted his name for persisting one more season. No one honored getting up every morning with a betraying body. Brian kept stepping onto the field, each time with less of himself, but with the same responsibility. He knew he was no longer the irreplaceable center, but he also knew that leaving before he was ready to admit the end was another kind of loss. So he stayed, caught between two states, no longer at the peak, but not yet accepting departure from the story. This phase, more than any before it, exposed the true nature of the double life. On the outside, Brian was still the icon trying to hold his form. On the inside, he was a man learning to live with the feeling of being betrayed by his own body. And there was no cheering for that journey, no medal for recognizing limits, just a quiet truth. Greatness doesn't vanish in a moment. It fades over time. As seasons connected to seasons, Brian understood the question was no longer whether he could continue. The question was what else the price of continuing would take away. And in the silence after every game, when the stands emptied, he stood alone with his body, listening to what it said not to argue, but to prepare for what no one cheers for, but cannot be avoided. Brian Urlacher's retirement decision didn't come as an emotional, decisive statement. It came quietly, almost administratively, like a belated acknowledgement that the role had died before the person could say goodbye. No more playbooks to memorize each week. No more formations to line up in. No more routine dictated by the schedule. And the hardest part, no one needed him anymore in the way he had been needed his whole life. In the early days after leaving the field, Brian woke up following old habits. The body still waited for commands. The mind still searched for targets. But there was no game plan, no strategy meetings, no roll call. Those voids weren't rest. They were rupture. A life once defined by standing in the right place in a complex system now had to face a brutally simple question. Where do I stand when there's no system anymore? Retirement didn't just take away a job. It took away language. Brian had spoken to the world through his role, through reading plays, crashing in, getting up. When that role vanished, familiar sentences had nowhere to land. You were no longer called because of immediate necessity. The phone went quieter. The calendar emptied. That silence didn't carry peace. It carried the color of no longer being loved in the old way. No more lineup meant no more guarantee. Before, every week had a place to go, a task to do, a value confirmed instantly. Now, everything had to be self-defined. And for someone who had lived too long as the living shield, asking what he wanted felt alien. Brian didn't lack discipline. He lacked a meaningful anchor. When a whole life was structured around meeting others' needs, sudden freedom could feel like free fall. No longer having playbooks also meant no longer having reasons to hide. The pains were no longer postponed for the next game. Thoughts were no longer pushed aside for preparation. Everything piled up in the present. Brian had to face a worn-down body, restless nights of broken sleep, mornings that needed time just to get moving. Before, pain had a purpose. Now, pain simply existed. And when pain no longer served a role, it forced the human to ask, what did I trade everything for? The feeling of no one needs me anymore didn't come from the world turning its back, but from the shift in what was demanded. The team needed others. The city moved on to new stories. The cycle didn't stop. Brian understood that intellectually, but emotions don't run on logic. When you were loved for a role, the disappearance of that role creates a void that fame can't fill. Past applause doesn't warm up this morning. There were days Brian tried to fill the void with old habits, training, discipline, routine. But without context, those things became empty. No game to aim for, effort lost its endpoint. He realized discipline once saved him on the field, but in post-role life, it needed a new purpose. A purpose not based on carrying for others. And that purpose didn't appear right away. The existential tragedy of retirement lies in having no opponent to defeat, no coach to ask, no scoreboard to tell you where you stand. Brian had to learn to live in the gray area, where there are no clear wins or losses, where progress is measured by reconciliation with himself. That was the hardest fight, because it didn't allow hiding behind a role. Old questions returned in new forms. If I'm no longer the defensive center, who am I? If I'm no longer needed in the old way, where does my value lie? Brian didn't answer those questions with words. He answered with time by accepting that there are days when nothing grand gets done, and that doesn't make him worth less. But to reach that acceptance, he had to pass through the sadness of being replaced. Retirement also exposed an uncomfortable truth. The role once protected the person from himself. When the role died, the naked human appeared, with deficits never dealt with. Brian had to learn to exist without constant validation, had to learn to speak when needed, a skill he had postponed his whole life, had to learn to stay in silence without turning it into a prison. The heavy message of this phase wasn't in material loss, but in the transformation of identity. When you were loved for a role, what remains when the role vanishes is the ability to love yourself without conditions. Brian had no map for that journey. He only had the experience of someone who lived very long for others, and now had to learn to live for his own truth. Perhaps the death of the role wasn't an ending, but the painful beginning of another life. A life where value doesn't come from taking hits for everyone, but from no longer having to take hits to be allowed to stay. But to step into that life, Brian had to mourn the old role, mourn the person the whole world once needed, to accept the person he needed now. And in that mourning, there was no shared ritual, only time, patience, and an open question he learned to carry every day. When the role disappears, do I still dare show up as a whole human being? After the role died, what remained wasn't absolute emptiness, but aftermath. Brian Urlacher entered the post-career years not in noise, but in a slow, steady, heavy rhythm of life. With no game schedule to cover reality, the body began speaking in its own voice, clear, persistent, impossible to ignore. Brian Urlacher lived with chronic pain like an uninvited guest who stayed. It didn't scream, it whispered every day, reminding him that everything really happened, that the years of endurance didn't vanish with the final whistle. Sleep became a challenge rather than rest. Brian didn't sleep deeply like before, didn't drift into unconsciousness easily. The body woke in the middle of the night, not from nightmares, but from small, relentless signals. Neck needing a position change, back needing time, knees protesting too much stillness. Those nights had no audience, no team trainer, no schedule to cling to, just one man and his body, learning to negotiate in silence. Mornings arrived not as energetic beginnings. They arrived like a lock-picking ritual. Brian sat up slowly, giving his body time to remember how to function. The first steps weren't rushed. They were a test. He listened to the response of every joint, every muscle, like an old craftsman checking tools that had been with him his whole life. Those stiff mornings didn't carry dramatic tragedy. They carried reality. And this reality didn't need to be proven or justified. It just needed to be lived with. In the new rhythm of life, with no plays to distract, thoughts came and went more freely. There were days Brian remembered the field, not as a specific place, but as a feeling, the feeling of being needed, being placed at the center, being trusted instantly. And there were days he remembered nothing at all, just focused on getting through the morning completely. Post-career wasn't constant sadness. It was a string of days without climaxes, where meaning had to be built from very small things. Family became the only place that didn't demand he be strong. No requirement for icon status, no expectation of infinite resilience, no counting how many times he got up. There, Brian didn't have to brace to show up. He could sit still, he could listen, he could admit fatigue without fear of disappointing anyone. That gentleness wasn't loud. It was persistent in a different way, not demanding. And because it didn't demand, it healed in a way the field never could. Conversations in the family didn't revolve around achievements or legacy. They revolved around today. How's the body? How was sleep? Is this morning easier than yesterday? Brian learned to say things he once avoided. Not every word was light, but they were real. And truth, even heavy, is easier to carry than prolonged silence. Living in the aftermath also meant accepting a new identity that wasn't clearly framed. Brian was no longer the center of the formation. He was the center of personal choices. When to train, how to rest, all no longer decided by someone else's schedule. That freedom was confusing at first, but over time, it became space to learn how to listen without arguing back. There were days when pain flared up, nights of broken sleep that stretched long. Brian didn't see that as failure. He saw it as information. The body was no longer armor. It was a partner that needed respect. Instead of commanding, he learned to ask. Instead of forcing, he learned to adjust. Those lessons weren't taught in strategy meetings, but they were just as necessary for long-term survival. The quiet tragedy of this phase didn't come from new loss, but from living with what can't be reversed. Brian didn't try to deny it. He didn't romanticize the pain either. He just lived with it, placed it in its proper spot in the day, so it didn't take over the whole space of the mind. That was a new skill, requiring more patience than strength. Every now and then, memories returned like silent film clips, not to demand regret, but to remind that the journey had meaning. Brian didn't need to go back to prove anything. The legacy was already there. What remained was life. No medals, no applause, but quiet mornings, slow meals, conversations without roles. Family, in all its simplicity, became the only place that allowed Brian not to be strong. And in not having to be strong, a different kind of strength appeared. The strength of full presence. No need to carry for anyone. No need to stand in front of collective anger. Just staying, listening, and accepting that living on after the peak isn't decline. It's continuation at a different rhythm. Living in the aftermath isn't a sad final chapter. It's a slow chapter. There, every day passes without needing to be won. It just needs to be lived right. And for Brian Urlacher, who spent his whole life taking hits for others, learning to live right with his body and his family, without bracing, without hiding, is perhaps the quietest victory, but also the hardest victory he ever achieved. There is no truly perfect closing moment for Brian Urlacher's story. No long whistle signaling a complete end. No healing ceremony, no late victory to make up for what was lost. As the post-career years passed, what stood out clearest wasn't leftover glory, but the raw truth of continuing to live after every role had fallen away. For Brian Urlacher, it wasn't the story of a man who overcame everything. It was the story of a man who accepted that not everything can be overcome, not completely healed. The body never returns to the starting point. The pains are still there, changing shape over time, but never disappearing. There are still mornings when the body is stiff, nights that are still restless. There are days when memories return uninvited, carrying the smell of field grass, the sound of collisions, the racing heartbeat before the moment of impact. Brian doesn't try to erase them. He places them where they belong, as irreversible markers, as proof that a life was lived to the fullest, even if the price was never light. No final victory, no late title to balance the books of sacrifice, no final chapter where everything gets neatly rearranged to look beautiful. Chicago keeps moving forward. The NFL keeps producing new icons. The world doesn't stop to wait for someone who was once the center. Brian understands that. And understanding doesn't make the emptiness disappear. It only makes the emptiness honest. No miracle. No awakening moment that turns pain into light. No dose of anything that gathers all that's been worn back into wholeness. The only thing that exists is time. And the way a person learns to live alongside time without resisting, Brian no longer races against limits. He walks beside them. Not because the limits vanish, but because fighting them has already taken too much. The absolute tragic core of this story doesn't lie in what Brian lost, but in how he learned to stop without calling it failure. His whole life, he was loved for his ability to endure, for standing there when others stepped back. But in the end, the most meaningful endurance didn't happen on the field. It happened in the days no one saw, when he chose not to prove anything anymore. America Star's signature doesn't celebrate miracles. It celebrates dignity in truth. Brian didn't become an icon because he was immortal. He became an icon because he accepted the price of being the shield for others, and then accepted the price of letting go at the right time. There is tragedy in that, but also a kind of calm that's hard to name. Some people live to win. Some people live to endure. Brian Urlacher lived long enough to understand the difference. He doesn't deny the past, nor does he cling to it like a final medal. He carries what remains not much, but enough to keep living without the role. Family, a slower rhythm of life. Unhurried mornings, those aren't rewards. They're the conditions for existing after the lights go out. If there is one single thing kept after everything, it's the right to be human. Not the one who takes hits for everyone. Not the center of the formation. Just a man who has walked the full curve of his path and understands that continuing to live doesn't mean continuing to sacrifice. And so, this story doesn't end with cheers. It ends with a calm acknowledgement, unadorned, unemphasized. Some lives are not completely healed. Some journeys have no final victory. Some people don't need miracles to have value. Brian Urlacher didn't survive because of strength. He survived because he endured long enough to know when to stop. The story of Brian Urlacher doesn't break hearts because of a spectacular collapse, but because of the prolonged erosion of a man forced to be strong for too long. From a childhood without a father, growing up in the survival discipline of a mother who couldn't afford gentleness, Brian learned early that to be kept around, you have to endure. That followed him through his entire journey in Chicago, where he became the living shield for an entire angry city, carrying the disappointments, mistakes, and expectations of millions. Details like pain being praised, painkillers becoming routine, or the Super Bowl arriving when knees and neck no longer obeyed, show just how high the price was for turning a human into an icon. The most heartbreaking part is when that double life spread into private life, a marriage that broke not from scandal, but from silence. Fatherhood played out in the shadows, without media defense, without protective glory, and ultimately retirement, the death of a role when there were no more playbooks, no more formations, no one needing him in the old way. The stiff mornings, restless sleep, chronic pain in the aftermath remind us that glory doesn't erase consequences. Honoring Brian Urlacher isn't by praising pure strength, but by acknowledging the dignity of a man who knew when to stop. The lesson for Americans lies here. A society that worships resilience needs to learn to value limits. Success shouldn't be built on silence in the face of pain, and human worth can't be tied only to roles. Brian didn't win in the end, wasn't completely healed, but he left a truthful message. Surviving isn't enduring forever. It's having the courage to choose the right moment to stop. If the story of Brian Urlacher makes you reflect on the quiet price behind strength and glory, please hit subscribe so we can keep exploring great lives that were never as easy as they appeared. Thank you for listening to the very end, and see you in the next video where we continue diving deep into the real, painful, but deeply valuable stories of America.